Okay, it's 10 o'clock. We're recording. Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to make a bit of noise for 5 minutes to allow other people to still join up, because we've got hundreds of people literally signed up for this morning's event to hear about the rollout of social prescribing. From local charities and national charities, I think from quite a number of infrastructure organisations in the voluntary sector. We've got a lot of colleagues joining from NHS trusts. We've got healthcare professionals joining us today. Link workers, I think, quite a few, and some actual citizens. You are really welcome, all of you, this morning. In preparing for today's webinar, we were obviously watching the numbers go up and up, and it struck me that this is so interesting to so many people right now, because I think we're all aware that we are meeting so much need right now in the community, with lockdown just behind us, with us being, I don't know, are we halfway through a pandemic? I don't know, sometimes you give up hope. But anyway, we're somewhere in a pandemic. And we're all aware, I think, that just doing what we've always done to meet the need that we are aware of isn't going to work. And I believe that that is why so many people are showing such an interest in the work we're talking about today, because I think we all understand on one level that we need to do something more creative and holistic to really meet people's needs and make sure that people can live as well a life as possible. And I think another thing really comes through in the conversations I'm having about the work we did here and we're talking about today, is that people understand that we need to find a way of ensuring that individuals themselves and communities are not just seen as a collection of problems, but also are seen as the people who ultimately hold some of the keys and some of the solutions. And I think that's what we're grappling with today, is how can we tap into this energy of communities? How can we help people to live as well as possible when the provision of medical services will continue to be severely restricted and might not in and of itself meet people's needs and demands. So a lot to think about today. So it's great that we have a lot of really interesting speakers here today to help us think through all of this. Before we really crack on with the substantial agenda, I will hand over to my colleague Sam. We're so pleased to have Sam here, because Sam, we were the victim of a virus attack yesterday, and Sam was spending literally all night and all morning trying to get his laptop to work again, but he has. So he is going to talk to us very briefly about technology. I assume you're all really quite aware of this now. We've been spending time in Zoom and team meetings now for much longer than we care to remember. So I'm sure we can keep it brief. Sam, over to you.
Morning, everyone. I'm Sam. I'm the comms officer at National Voices. I'm going to quickly run through the tech. If you haven't used Zoom before, Ella, if you go to the next slide, that'd be great. So if you haven't used Zoom before, the microphone and video settings are in the bottom left-hand corner. Currently, at the moment, you are all muted. This is because of the sheer amount of numbers that we've got on this webinar today, but the panel will have their microphones on. Today, we're going to get you to contribute in the chat. To launch the chat, you have the speech icon at the bottom there. If you could launch that now and introduce yourselves, that'd be great. And Ella, we've got one more tech slide to go. And as I said, yeah, if you could introduce yourself in the chat. With Zoom, there's a couple of things you might want to fiddle around with right now. The enter the full screen option. Your view options are going to be on the top hand side of the screen. If you've got any tech questions during this, please feel free to message any of the National Voices team or myself, and we'll try and help you out. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Sam. I mean, he makes it sound like it's easy, and yeah, sometimes it is and sometimes it isn't. I'm trying to control my anxiety about a tech failure. We had 850 people sign up to today's webinar. We're not thinking all 850 will necessarily be here all morning, but it would be such a shame if the technology let us down. Anyway, let's assume that the tech gods are on our side. This is the agenda we're going to work through today. We left plenty of time for questions at the end, but we also have quite a lot of content to download. And so we've divvied that up as follows. Kate Jopling, who is a associate of National Voices, and who was one of the 3 people together with Dan and Amy who led on the research we're talking about today, is going to talk about the engagement we had with over 300 community groups and what we have found. Craig Lister from the Conservation Volunteers is talking about some research they have done, funded by the National Lottery Community Fund, and what they have found. And then we've got, I'm really looking forward to that, Sajid Hashmi from Barry, who is talking to us about what it's really like in practice and what they have done and how they have experienced the rollout of social prescribing, what they've learned, what's worked, what's not worked. And finally, James Sanderson, who is Director for Personalised Care at NHS England and Improvement, will talk about what NHS England and maybe the wider NHS are doing in order to really capitalise on the opportunities that arise out of the rollout of social prescribing. As I said, we will then have questions. We will name people who we will ask to contribute a question, and we will have a discussion amongst panel members, and then we will close, and we will make sure that you're all back at your desks, if you're not at your desk right now, at 11:30. So, if that is all good, I'm sort of asking that question of the team. Have I forgotten anything? Speak now or be silent forever. I think I take that as consent.
We're all good to go, Charlotte.
Okay, we are going to go straight into the substance of the meeting, and Kate Jopling is going to talk about the work they have done and what they have brought back by way of learning. Over to you, Kate.
Okay, thank you. Morning, everyone. Hope you can hear me all right. I am going to try to do justice in not very many minutes to a report that I worked on along with Amy Cole and Dan Jones, which is called Rolling Out Social Prescribing, Understanding the Experiences of the Voluntary Community and Social Enterprise Sector, and you're going to get a copy to read in detail. So just a little bit, I think it's really important to say that social prescribing is about bridging that gap between the health system and the resource and capacity and knowledge of the voluntary and community sector to really meet people's social, emotional and practical needs in a way that we know helps people stay well. And that is something that our sector has been working on for many, many years. So social prescribing isn't new. But what we saw in the first half of this year was a real huge commitment by NHS England to this piece of work and a massive acceleration of rollout. And that generated a lot of noise, lots of strong views. And so we were asked by the NHS England Personalised Care Group to kind of dig into that a bit, to really understand what was going on for the voluntary community and social enterprise sector, and how this was being experienced, what was working, and where people were finding ways around some of the issues and how we could share those. So we benefited from the insights of over 300 colleagues up and down the country, initially face-to-face and then more recently online and over the phone. And this is our synthesis of the really key issues that came through from those conversations. I think it is important, as Charlotte says, that we talk to people from charities large and small, from very much health sector charities through to arts and culture organisations, community groups, people working on physical activity. This is very much a cross-section. And so it also was a views of people who are kind of long in the tooth, as it were, in the nicest possible way around social prescribing, and those who are newer to it. So that's what we're presenting back today and where these lessons come from. And I'm now going to kind of rattle through the 5 key themes that we talked about. And I think the first thing to say is across all these themes, what we found was diversity of experience. So really, when social prescribing had gone well, it was where we had this embedded, strong, collaborative relationships between the voluntary sector and the health system, where those relationships were working functionally, and link workers often then slotted neatly in to this existing structure and trusting relationship. And so we did, as we went around the country, hear quite a lot about how the process of rapid recruitment of new link workers through primary care networks had gone, and we think there are some lessons to learn there. The first is that it worked best when link workers were embedded into the voluntary sector And therefore, our sense is that what we should be moving to is a voluntary sector by default model of link worker recruitment. Now, we have seen really strong moves from NHS England to try to encourage voluntary sector involvement in the recruitment of link workers, and I think that's really positive. We think we should be operating with that as default. I think the other key issue, and I know that this is going to come through more as we talk, is this issue of the funding and how the funding is used to cover not just the cost of the link worker role themselves, but also those on costs, the training, the support, the travel, the management, and all those other issues. So that has come through. Again, we saw a movement on that issue with £2,400 being allocated to those on costs. But I think what we are saying is we really need flexibility, and as we move to recruit more link workers, we definitely need that flexibility for the sector to use the funding that's available in ways that are going to make sense. We heard about a need to clarify the link worker role. The guidance talks about all the enormous range of things that link workers need to do, and it is a diverse role. But I think we need some clarity, because we heard that in some places the role was being confused with clinical roles, in other places expectations weren't realistic. We need to be much clearer about what the role is and what we can realistically expect of link workers, particularly when they're working with people with complex needs. And again, another opportunity as we roll out more and more link workers into the community is to be really clear about that distinct role of community building, that community development work that is so, so important alongside that individual link working. And we think there's an opportunity to define that as a separate role going forward. So the next issue was measurement. Again, really key watchwords here are proportional and appropriate. Nobody in our sector was saying they didn't want to understand the impact of either the work they specifically were doing or of social prescribing overall. It's really, really important to all of us that we build the evidence for social prescribing. But we need to make sure the measures that we're asking people to use are proportionate. So wellbeing measures, the very strong view, are the ones that will be most appropriate for link workers to use. And in most cases, things like the patient activation method that are more clinically slanted are just not going to be appropriate in that relationship. A very clear message from our discussions. When it comes to the community organisations, the services, the activities, we need to be proportional. We need to find measures that are appropriate to the delivery that's happening. And what that means in many cases where we know an intervention has a proven evidence base around it and its impact on wellbeing, we probably only need to know that people are turning up. But again, there's a whole range of ways in which the sector demonstrates its impact, and we need to have the flexibility to do that. But it's important that we do understand the impact of the health system. And what we also heard was a desire to get better at sharing data across the health system and the VCSE sector so that it can really understand what's going on with social prescribing. The next issue was funding, and this is the big one. And I know that my colleague Craig will talk more about this because it's been a big theme in the work that they've done. I think critically, the issue with funding is that there is funding for link workers, but there hasn't been funding for the activities in communities, particularly in some areas. There has been additional demand on the sector, and that hasn't been met with funding. The reality is that it isn't social prescribing that's creating that demand. What it's doing is identifying need in the community. It's identifying need that our sector is really well placed to meet. We are well placed to support people with the practical, emotional, and social issues that will enable them to achieve health outcomes. And I think what we're saying is we need that recognition of that value we're creating at a strategic level and a strategic approach to making sure the funding flows to meet that. Because the truth is that the sector cannot absorb additional demand without new resource. And if that were true when we started these conversations pre-COVID, it's really true now. And so many of these services have a unit cost. It isn't stretchy demand. We need to make sure that we're recognising and valuing those critical outcomes that the sector is achieving and funding is flowing. Sort of links to the next theme, which is inequality. Inequality was a big conversation because I think all of us believe that meeting people's needs in the round is a really good way of addressing health inequalities. But we heard that there was a risk that actually, if we don't take a really deliberate approach to addressing inequality through social prescribing, it could exacerbate the problem, because what you'd see is people in areas where there is more getting more. So we need to do two things really deliberately and carefully. The first is we need to think about those people who mainstream social prescribing will not support, people who need a specialist service. And we heard, for example, about refugees and migrants, perhaps traveller communities. There are communities for whom this will not work as a mainstream service, and we need to make sure that the rollout doesn't squeeze out those specialist provisions. I think we also need to make sure that we're addressing those inequalities that we see in communities when we're funding the sector, and particularly we think this could be a real priority for the National Academy, to make sure that we're ensuring that where there is additional funding, particularly at central level, it's channelled into those communities where the sector is weaker. Finally, kind of loops back round the final theme to where we started in this conversation, which is that social prescribing works well. Can we have the next slide? There. Social prescribing works well when there are existing quality, strong, equitable relationships between and across the voluntary sector. And I think it's really therefore important that we do not lose focus on this. We have accelerated partnership through COVID. We've definitely seen new relationships being built. But the truth is that collaboration is work, and it requires time and resource, and there's no shortcut for that, because if we don't get it right, things don't work as well. So I think the first thing we're saying is we really need to make sure we're focusing on putting the time and resource into collaboration. And the second key thing we're flagging is that the footprints of many parts of the health system that we are now developing, the primary care networks, the ICSs, those are not the footprints of our voluntary sector colleagues. And so we need to make sure, if we want to be able to engage equitably at that level, that we're resourcing the infrastructure the sector needs to enable it to collaborate effectively. So those are the key themes in the report. You will be able to read more about the detail and hear all the things I've missed when you get the copy soon, but thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate. I mean, what a brilliant summary in such limited time. There is more, obviously, in the report, and importantly, and I really urge you to have a look. There's some really interesting case studies from all over the country about, you know, about organisations that are large, about organisations that are very local, and I think there's a lot of learning in those stories as well. So we didn't have time really to unpack that in this presentation, but it's well worth having a look. So all those resources are on our website, and we will obviously also hit social media with it today, as we say. Rather than taking up more airspace, I am going to hand over to Craig Lister. Craig is the Managing Director of the Conservation Volunteers Green Gym, and they use natural environment and meaningful activity to improve health. He is an exercise physiologist by trade and works across the VCSE sector, the NHS, public health and academia. And he has done this work funded by the community fund of the National Lottery. So over to you, Craig. We're really looking forward to hearing how your learning complements
Hello, Charlotte, can you hear me? Oh, okay. Craig, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Craig, sorry, I think Charlotte, we just lost her there.
Choosing this title, Enabling the Potential of Social Prescribing, because I think social prescribing has already been a success in many ways, in that it has landed against a lot of people who thought it might not. So we're in a really good place, as in how we've started, but there's so much further to go, and that's what we want to help people realise. So if I can have the next slide, please. First of all, I want to pass some really personal thank yous, actually, because this has been a collaborative effort over the last couple of years. First and foremost to players of the National Lottery, because without that funding from the National Lottery Community Fund, we wouldn't have been able to do this work. And of course, the National Lottery also funds many of the areas of provision. I want to thank Marie and Helen, who've helped me enormously on this piece of work, and Rachel, Lee and Amanda, who've helped us put it together into the very visually impactful piece of work that it is, and Gwen, who's translated it into Welsh for us. I work closely with colleagues from the NHS as well, and they've been very helpful. And perhaps, you know, equally with the National Lottery players, everyone who's contributed to and supported social prescribing. And you'll see that little banner on the right, which was 745. We had 745 responses to our questionnaire. So thank you so much for that. And that was from across the UK. So what we've found in the research, and we delved into the data in quite some detail, was that referrals are increasing, not just in number, but from where they're coming from too. So GP practices, as you would expect, but more and more from allied health professionals and community work, a huge number from adult social care, and perhaps you might expect that to continue increasing, but also newer areas, so Department of Work and Pensions, police, social workers, and this spread of increase has happened across the UK in all of the home countries. Obviously, you'll note those numbers don't add up to 100%. That's because we've taken details from different people, so to present it like that. Next slide, please. So against that backdrop of increase in demand is a dwindling capacity. And this is a real challenge now for the voluntary sector in its widest sense. So what you told us was there was only around about 18% capacity left in demand, and between 32 and 50% of you, depending on where you came from, said you had no capacity at all. And of those people who said that they did have some additional capacity, it was really linked to additional funding as well. And what I found in the voluntary sector is that there is this disparity in people believing the voluntary sector can do things for no funding, when in fact, you know, the costs are there as in any other organisation. And so this dwindling capacity is partly a function of the increase of numbers of link workers coming through, which again is a positive thing. So, you know, we need to extract the positives from this, but there's a real recognition now of a dwindling capacity, and that was before or during the impact of COVID. And we know that the voluntary sector, particularly the smaller groups, are going to be severely impacted by this, and we undoubtedly see a reduction in the number of providers. Next slide, please. So if we look at the current funding sources, it's a real shotgun approach, really. And I suppose what I would start by saying is that my personal view is that social prescribing benefits everybody and every organisation in society. It can do that. Obviously health, but also antisocial behaviour, access to work, a whole range of issues. And if you accept that social prescribing can positively influence the breadth of society, then everybody should fund it, I think, perhaps through the integrated care systems in England, through different boards in Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland, and certainly in Scotland, we're seeing some innovative work around that. But you can see the current funding sources are quite spread out. So from no funding at all, it's good to see clinical commissioning groups and primary care networks starting to put money in. Local authorities, again, the national lottery, as you would expect. So it's a real shotgun approach, and it varies significantly across the UK. And what we'd like to see is a more coherent approach. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so what we found from the data, we had open text boxes in our research, and this is where Marie and Helen particularly did a lot of work to understand what that meant. And what that said to us was that there was 5 interconnected themes, and they were a lack of equity. And we heard from Kate earlier about equity, and I'm going to say something about that in the next slide as well. And this need for long-term funding. The voluntary sector is often moving from short-term funding to short-term funding. So a disproportionate amount of the good work they could do is focused on finding the next component of funding. And there's a need for this core funding as well, so just to simply function. And then one challenge particularly is a lack of money moving across sectors towards the activities that take place. So there's money driving the increase in link workers, but the actual provision, the capacity to do something as a consequence of that, the money hasn't got there just yet. There's a disengagement between those two processes. And obviously, as I said before, a wide range in approaches to generating income, and we'd like that stabilised a little bit. Next slide, please. And so this is the slide I spoke to you about equity. So some time ago, a couple of years ago, and many of you would have helped create this, we wrote the quality assurance for social prescribing template. And in there, we said that we view social prescribing as equitable to any other form of prescribing, and it needs to show equity. And I think what we've seen is that it has, frankly, a huge increase in the ability to capture data and feed data back, to professionalism. And given that, my view is now it's time for the system, and that is the whole system I spoke about earlier, to show equity in the funding processes as well as it would for any other treatment of a condition. And I'm not saying there that the money should come from the NHS. The NHS should be part of the funding process, but the system, because the system benefits, should provide a funding through pots that already, processes that already exist. Next slide, please. And so these are our recommendations, or in fact, they're your recommendations, because this is what we gathered from the huge response that we got. And I should just say that there's a short report which is available. The link will be given to you at the end of this process. But there's also a much longer report where there's all the core data and the raw data, which will help you write bids into awarding bodies and different organisations. But these are your recommendations. Any organisation that takes referrals should receive financial investment for that. So there should be a clear recognition that there's a cost to providing that. But long-term core funding for the provision of activities should be made as well, so that we can plan ahead 2, 3, 4, 5 years as charities, rather than going from this year-to-year process at the moment. And that stability improves outcomes for everybody. But stakeholders must collaborate in ways that increase community capital. And Kate said, as did we found areas where it works really well, but often that was where the relationship had started to form earlier. So I think a huge amount of work needs to be done on that. And that's the VCSE reaching out to link workers and link workers reaching into the VCSE in that collaborative process. Obviously, link workers need to have the appropriate equipment and caseload size, and there's work going on towards that. And talking to equity around everybody being able to access social prescribing. And certainly that's a challenge. And I think one of the things I would say to end this, if you like, is that I'm also a health emergency planner, and I have been until the last couple of weeks, the chair of the voluntary cell across Bedfordshire, Luton and Milton Keynes as a response to COVID. And the VCSE sector is crucial to community resilience, whether that be social prescribing or COVID now. And we found challenges in accessing everybody within society that we want to. But investment in the voluntary sector for social prescribing will also provide enhanced community resilience. And so you get this sort of multiplier effect of investment into the voluntary sector, which I believe is rather unique within the health system. And I think if we make more of that, or we can identify that more in a responsible manner and an evidential manner, hopefully I think that will see people be able to understand the value of funding into the voluntary sector. And we hope that this report will help people make those decisions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Craig. Really, again, a really short and snappy summary of, I'm sure, a much larger piece of work. And of course, we will be sharing links to all this work, and you can access the detail. Right. We've got a lot of stuff to get through. Again, apologies that I think some of us lost connectivity at one point. We don't know whether that means that we've lost some of the content that was on the chat. We will check that out. And it is what it is, but it's good to see all of you back. You didn't use that opportunity to disappear and do something else, which is great. And we are now going to hear from a kind of practical perspective. And Sajid is going to talk about his work. Sajid, are you around?
I'm on mute. Hello there. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. We've been running social prescribing in Bury since January this year. Spent about 3 months of the previous year getting it up and ready. Next slide, please. I don't need the introductions. Right. So, as social prescribing is basically what is a single point of access for services within the voluntary sector, and that's what we're doing here. A lot of engagement with the MDTs, which is the multidisciplinary teams, and the INTs, which are the integrated neighbourhood teams, which is basically various agencies coming together to look at complex cases. And the whole aspect of it, which is GPs, secondary care, primary care, and referring them to services across the board, particularly in the voluntary sector. Next slide, please. So, issues and problems. Firstly, we are only being provided with the basic salary costs. Overheads are not included. And I don't know how they expect staff to work, but obviously they need the system around them in order to operate efficiently. The other problem we got is we've got 4 primary care networks with 5 neighborhoods. The contract with our local CCG for the core costs is 2 years. The primary care network roles are for 5 years, so there's a discrepancy there. Secondly, funding is a big problem. It's rigid and prescriptive because it's come from funny money. When I say funny money, because GM is devolved, the actual money has come through the transformation fund. So it's not core funding. So we don't know how we're planning a five-year delivery with just 2 years funding. Referrals are a problem. The system is not universal. Each GP is a business in its own right, and they operate themselves. And not all GPs are engaged. Because they're not engaged, not because they don't like social prescribing, but because they've just got too much on, or it's not simple enough for them to refer through the system. This is all not sustain. Sorry, I just wanted to touch on that. The other issues that we've got is that obviously, like I said, it's not sustainable. There's a cost of the database which is used to manage the system, which is again not funded, and it makes it very difficult to have that sort of overarching view on everything. Next slide, please. The other issue is the voluntary and community sector. Services within the voluntary and community sector are not free. There is a cost to this. And the voluntary community sector organizations are not sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for clients to come across. Most of them are very, very busy. They're snowed under with demand, and quite a few have got waiting lists between 4 to 26 weeks. So if you wanted to refer a client for mental health support, you're looking at an 18-week wait, which again, you cannot provide social prescribing without resources for the voluntary community sector organizations that you're looking to provide those services. Huge issue is there's no core funding. Someone needs to cover the costs of hosting those primary care networks. I beg your pardon, the social prescribing workers. And volunteers are touted as the solution to the problem. However, volunteers need a structure around them. They need the infrastructure to be able to provide those services. Volunteers need resources, and they need to be supported by paid staff. And then there is the issue about people who are returning to work once all this furlough is ending. But then if you're on benefits, you can't volunteer because technically you're not available for work. And we've had people who've had sanctions on their benefits because they were volunteering. Next slide, please. So what do we want to do to resolve the issue? What we would like is we would like a contribution to the hosting costs, not just the salary, cover the overheads of those posts. The voluntary sector organizations that we are referring to, they need resources, they need resourcing. So the referrals that we send to the voluntary sector must have some sort of funding attached to them. So when they walk in, they're walking in with a voucher or something that says, I am entitled to this service and I will pay for that service, or somebody will pay for that service. We need consistency across the various GP surgeries, both in primary care, and we also need consistency in secondary care. We do take self-referrals, but I don't know how sustainable that will be in the long run if that starts to increase significantly. And we need local solutions based on local partnerships. So, for example, GPs that have formed those PCNs here in Bury have not formed them on a geographical basis. They've formed it with the GP that they get along with. So you have a GP in one neighborhood who is in a PCN with a GP in another neighborhood. So that neighborhood working, cross-sector working is very difficult to do. Information governance is a huge problem. It's been ignored, it's been brushed under the carpet, but we're in the face of it. If something goes wrong, it's our reputation that's on the line. And that's so the COVID issue has established the need of the voluntary sector. The local response to COVID demand was totally based on voluntary sector response. So the NHS needs to recognize it as well. Voluntary community sector need to be equal partners, not an add-on. So it's GPs, it's primary care, secondary care. Oh, and we might look at voluntary sector. We need to be there right at the beginning. And social prescribing has to be integral to health and social care delivery locally, not an add-on. And the CCG and local NHS need to support social prescribing rather than us having to rely on funny money from the lottery or anyone else. Next slide, please. And that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sajid. It's always really, I always find it really inspiring to hear from the people who are actually doing the job. And you struck a good balance between sort of emphasizing the potential for us to get it right and how important the VCSE and the charity sector has been during the COVID crisis, how we've really proven our value to people and to the system, and how we now need to sort of make sure we get this onto a more sustainable footing. I'm going to hand over to James Sanderson from the NHS, from NHS England, who is Director of Personalised Care. James has prepared a few slides to talk about the plans from their side. I wonder whether he also can respond to a few of the things people have said so far, but you know, we have time in the chat to cover all of that. So James, 10 minutes over to you.
Fabulous. Thank you very, very much, Charlotte. And congratulations to Charlotte and Kate and the team at National Voices, and to Craig and the team at the Conservation Volunteers for two really, really superb reports this morning that give us some great insights into social prescribing and the benefits and challenges that we have to address. I also wanted to say a big thanks to everyone that's contributed to the report. So a fantastic amount of effort that's gone into providing some really high quality feedback, and also to everyone that's joined this webinar this morning, because I recognise that a huge amount of representation from voluntary sector organisations who've really been the lifeblood of social prescribing and have created a fantastic, dynamic, thriving environment for social prescribing across the country that is providing really agile, amazing, compassionate care and support for people. Just in terms of a few things that I wanted to say, I thought it was good just to quickly go back and just remind everyone where this came from and the context for social prescribing, because social prescribing doesn't sit on its own. It's not something that the NHS just invented on a whim. In fact, you know, we didn't invent it at all. Social prescribing has been going for many, many years, and pioneers like Sam Etherington in Bromley by Bow and Mike Dixon in Columpton have been practicing forms of social prescribing for probably 30 years plus now. And what we felt at NHS England when we looked at the opportunities for developing a greater system of personalised care a few years ago, probably going back about 5 years ago now, we recognised that there was a huge amount of work going on across the country. Some fantastic pioneers in lots of pockets of the country who were doing really sound work to engage people more effectively in their care and support. And you've got organisations like Conservation Volunteers, you know, there's Green Gyms, Craig tells me they've been running for 25 years, there's care farms across the country, we've got lots of arts and cultural based organisations, we've got the work that National Voices have championed for many years on person-centred care. So there's a huge amount of work ongoing across the country, and we wanted to learn from that. And what we did is we reached out and we worked collaboratively with members of the community, with people with lived experience extensively through a programme that we called Integrated Personalised Commissioning. And through that, we started to draw together what was a very fragmented approach across the NHS and care system to personalised care. And we brought everything together. And this was what we came up with, which was massively co-produced, and we called it our comprehensive model for personalised care. And the whole point of this was creating the opportunity for personalised care to be rolled out universally across the NHS, because we felt that these pockets of fantastic practice needed a greater sense of ownership across the NHS. We recognised that there was something really, really magical in these opportunities. So if I can have the next slide, please. This is our operating model. So this is where social prescribing fits in. And when we talk about personalised care, we talk about people having choice and control over the way their care is planned and delivered, and that's based on what matters to people. And importantly, it builds on the assets that they bring to their own care, because people are experts in their own health and well-being, and communities and individuals have a huge amount of strength and assets that they bring to their own care. So we wanted to build care and support around people's individual needs. And these 6 components here are the core to how we deliver personalised care across the NHS. So it starts with shared decision making, starts with a different conversation with somebody based on what matters to them, ensures that they've got a very holistic personalised care and support plan. And then we have the 3 areas underneath: social prescribing, community-based support, supported self-management, how we can boost skills, knowledge and confidence, and personal health budgets, giving the opportunity of people to be more in control of their health and well-being. And the reason for this, and the reason that we're trying this different approach, is because we know that putting people in better control of their health improves their outcomes, and also improves outcomes for the system. For example, we know that people who are supported to self-manage, people that are able to be moved from having very low skills, knowledge and confidence about their health care to very high skills, knowledge and confidence, it will reduce the amount of time that they spend with the GP by 19% and reduce the amount of hospital admissions by 38%, which is fantastic outcomes for them just by boosting their confidence to manage long-term conditions. In relation to social prescribing, what we recognise at the moment is that 1 in 5 GP appointments now are purely for a non-medical need. Somebody is reaching out to their GP because they're in debt, because they've got relationship issues, they're socially isolated or lonely, they've got housing problems. And actually, capturing these people within the NHS is not right. We'd over-medicalise the approach. Additionally to this, at least another 1 in 5 appointments, maybe somebody with a more traditional medical condition, but actually it's a psychosocial approach that's required to support them that could be beneficial both instead of or alongside a medical approach. So for example, swimming for arthritis is proven to be very, very successful. So we recognise that actually there's a fantastic opportunity if we begin to connect people differently. And social prescribing has become, because it was already thriving in the community, it was already creating a lot of excitement based on a social movement principle. People were demanding it. The NHS has simply responded to the demand that was out there. And as Craig said, social prescribing is not creating the demand, it's just recognising that this demand exists and looking for the most effective mechanism to support people. So how do we launch social prescribing then? So we built this momentum with the comprehensive model over a period of 2 years. Then in January 2019, we launched Universal Personalised Care, working with National Voices alongside other partners, which was really our blueprint for how we could improve care and support for people in the NHS. And social prescribing was a major part of that. In the long-term plan, we committed to personalised care being one of the 5 key shifts for the NHS, alongside digital revolutions, reform of A&E, primary care and outpatients. So personalised care was one of the 5 key shifts in the NHS long-term plan. And then we set out to make social prescribing matter. And this is our standard model for social prescribing. You can see the core components there. And many of the things that have come up in the reports around the way in which collaborative partnership working between the statutory and voluntary sector takes place, the way in which support for community groups and workforce development this is the model that we co-produce for social prescribing. You can see many of those things being reflected in some of the recommendations that have come out in the reports. We've had incredible success over the last year with the recruitment of link workers. Last year there were around 300 link workers in place, and there are now 1,250 across primary care networks, and that's growing rapidly. We're seeing a huge response and excitement to people wanting to become link workers, and it's a very growing, vibrant workforce. And I'm really grateful to everybody that has stepped up to become a link worker, and are doing some fantastic support. And particularly over the last few months during the pandemic, there's been a huge amount of pressure on link workers. And I think the service has responded incredibly well. There's been some really, really amazing efforts put in. And I hear on a daily basis some fantastic examples of how link workers have supported people during the pandemic, have provided an amazing response. But I know there's some pressure as well, of course, partly due to the demand that has been caused by the pandemic, and partly due to the fact that, you know, we're at the cusp of a new revolution in healthcare here. I mean, this is going to take us some time. A lot of people describe social prescribing as the third revolution in health. If you consider that the first was around you know, running water and sanitation, the second was around modern medicine movement with antibiotics and surgical procedures, and the third really is this reflection that what makes us well is a wider set of circumstances than just the NHS, and recognising that, you know, across what I call the 4 zones of social prescribing: arts and culture, sport and physical activity, the natural environment, and advice, information and guidance. Across those 4 areas, we need to find ways to connect people to their health in a different way. And the amazing thing about social prescribing is how it's bringing lots of partnerships together. I mean, Craig mentioned that this was about how different agencies could work. You know, the funding, it's great to see that 38% of the funding currently is coming from NHS organisations, but, you know, social prescribing isn't just for the NHS, and we are seeing that through the range of partners that want to work with us. We're seeing arts and cultural organisations, we're seeing sports organisations, we're seeing Department for Environment, you know, Natural England, Sport England, and the Arts Council, all working really collaboratively with us at the moment to help social prescribing to thrive. We recognise the pressure on link workers, and we launched a rapid recruitment programme a few weeks ago. And we're really pleased that 350 plus PCNs have taken us up on the offer of support for accelerated recruitment of link workers. We're hoping that that will provide another 500 link workers into the system, which will start to alleviate some of that pressure with existing link workers in practice. But our overall aim over the next few years is to get to 4,500 link workers to provide the infrastructure that we need across the whole of primary care, so that we can provide a universal service that has been called for to make sure that everybody can access social prescribing. So 4,500 link workers is our aim, but we're keeping that in check. We're making sure that that's still the right number to meet the demand. One of the really positive things is that 75% of those link workers are employed in the voluntary sector. So, you know, the recommendations of trying to get to voluntary sector by default is quite an interesting one. You consider that 3/4 of link workers are already in the voluntary sector, and we've obviously provided additional cash to the voluntary sector for the on costs, and the rapid recruitment programme provides additional support for the voluntary sector in order to help PCNs with that recruitment. So I think this creates a great opportunity to work in a renewed partnership, and bringing social prescribing into the mainstream health service has been a massive task. That's you know, a huge contribution of lots of partners. The NHS didn't recognise this with the same level of importance as other aspects. We now have social prescribing embedded into the GP contract. To be a primary care network, you have to be offering a social prescribing service. It's part of the mainstream NHS, but it only became part of the mainstream NHS a year ago. So some of the issues that we're facing now, I recognise are teething troubles of a new system, of the way in which we need to adapt the NHS to recognise the value of social prescribing and continue to build it as a component part of the NHS service that can truly thrive. Alongside all of the work that we're doing within NHS England, we've been organising significant numbers of webinars. There's a fortnightly webinar series for link workers. There's link worker training through Health Education England. But we also recognised that we needed support in other ways. And last year, I was asked to look at forming an independent organisation by the Secretary of State, which we have worked on again with a number of partners to co-produce what that organisation should do. And pleased to announce that we now are up and running as the National Academy for Social Prescribing, registered charity that's going to be sitting outside the NHS to take forward the improvement of the context for social prescribing. And we look forward to working with partners across conservation volunteers, national voices and others that are on this call this morning to look at the findings of these reports and incorporate that into our strategy for NASP. So you can see here the 5 things that NASP is going to be doing very simply, raising the profile of social prescribing, getting the momentum up there, making sure people know about it in all of the different sectors that can support this, and really creating the opportunity for it to thrive, finding resources that may not just be financial resources, that may be resources in kind from organisations, but making sure that we can get local and national organisations investing in social prescribing, building relationships, collaborative partnerships, improving the evidence, working with academic partners, and spreading what works. Just to finish off then, I think that we have a fantastic movement here now. And what's really pleasing about these 2 reports is whilst they inevitably raise some challenges, we're not now talking about whether social prescribing should or should not exist. We're not now talking about what it should be called, or some of those conversations that were happening a year or 2 years ago. We've made the case, we're all recognising that we've got something here that works incredibly well, that we've got a new way of working between statutory and voluntary sector bodies, and we need to find the best ways to continue the collaboration that started this all off, because, as I say, this came from communities. We need to make sure it continues to thrive in those communities. So thank you very much. Back to you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, James. You've all been brilliant presenters, sticking to time, which is kind of unheard of, really. I think we've all become a bit more disciplined through these with tighter controlled webinars than we maybe were when we were all assembling in big halls and rambling on somewhat sometimes. It's been a real pleasure to listen to the 4 of you. There's so much coming out of all of this already, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat, and oh my God, I don't know, we need someone's conduit to us to mine all the insight that is surfacing in the chat. I don't think I'll do justice to all of this, but just, I think what we've heard is, James just called it teething problems. I don't know whether that is maybe minimalizing it a little bit, but there is something there about, there is some problems that need ironing out around sustainability. I think I heard a lot of from all presenters and also in the chat, just problems with sheer capacity. And obviously funding connects those 2 questions of sustainability and capacity quite directly. But there's also something about relationships and how maybe we need to still make the case towards some primary care professionals in particular, that how this can work better. I've heard something around culture change. I think that was very clear also in what James said, about also what others said. We're dealing with 2 sectors that have very different cultures. And I think some of the problems we're describing and experiencing come from us having to learn to work together. I've heard quite a lot around inequalities from all of you and also on the chat. How can we prevent this just working for people who are quite good at helping themselves, who are quite good at asking for additional support? And how can we make sure that communities that have specific needs can have those met? And again, there is a question then around funding and more strategically channeled funding maybe. I've also had interesting questions around how this fits in with social care, which I think is really interesting and important, and the NHS finds that sometimes quite hard to bear in mind when they roll out their problems, is that a lot of the people we're thinking about will also be in contact with social care services, and that social care has developed parallel yet unconnected ways of doing something slightly similar. I've heard people talk about this as a movement and how we're sort of on a journey together that requires the input from so many different people in so many different ways. We have some questions that we will pick from the chat, and then we will see how much time we have again for wrapping up in a more general perspective. I am going to first ask Michelle Dawson, who leads a really important project and successful project in Middlesbrough. I think it was originally focused on older people, but it's certainly quite a wide definition of ageing services. Michelle, can you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. So in Middlesbrough, we are successfully engaging GPs from Middlesbrough and Stockton Mind perspective, who I work for, in social prescribing. So much so that a lot of the primary care networks now want more link workers and to expand their service. I think from this report, it recommends that the VCS is the default provider for social prescribing, but we know that we can't afford to effectively deliver at scale due to the line management costs and on costs of properly supporting the staff working with this level of complexity. So I think there was the NHS triangle, had that bit at the top around acute needs and all of that stuff. That's what our social prescribers generally work with in Middlesbrough, mainly because it's really deprived. So bearing in mind, we're not expecting the NHS or our local authority or our CCG, who are very, very skint, to kind of stump up any more money. What would you see as a short term, I'm asking the panel, what would you see as a short term, so next 12 to 18 month solution to wanting to expand link worker teams, it being a successful service with the VCS as a default provider, but with no extra money?
Yes,
how are we planning on bridging this gap? So anyone in the panel, but I don't really mind. That's our current quandary, is success is great, but not if it doesn't come with the ability to expand.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you are, I think like some other people here on the chat, sort of becoming a victim of your own success, which is obviously a brilliant situation to be in. On one level, you've proven that people want this, you've proven that GPs want it, and that the citizens of Middlesbrough want it. It works, but how can you scale it now? It would be such a shame to waste this moment. Maybe James, we start with you. Have you got any thoughts on how this short-term or long-term gap could be bridged?
It's great to hear from you again, Michelle, actually, and fantastic work that's been going on in Middlesbrough. I've been watching very, very closely. I think, you know, you set out the massive challenge of anything that's pioneering and new in this sort of way. And it's great to see that, as you described, Charlotte, that we're becoming sort of victims of our own success, really, with some of this. We are looking to respond very, very rapidly to this. I mean, there's huge investment that the NHS has already put into this through the infrastructure, through the primary care contract, and we responded when there was issues originally around no on costs with the additional money that was put into the system. And as I say, we were responding with rapid recruitment and additional cash going out there to make sure that we've got the resources required to support it to continue to grow. I think what we need to do is now organise much better at a regional level. One of the things that I'm doing through the National Academy Social Prescribing is creating 7 regional hubs that's going to help bring together groups of people at a local level to consider how best to distribute funding, because it's not something that we can do nationally, of course. I mean, everyone on this call will recognise that. I mean, I don't have the expertise or the insight to know whether Huddersfield needs a walking group or a men in sheds group or a knit and natter club. You know, we need those decisions to be made at a local level. So we've got to find mechanisms of getting cash down to that ultra local level where it can be distributed and organised by the people that know best, that will support those communities. So I think that the key here is for PCNs and voluntary sector partners at a local level, along with CCGs and local government, to be working together. Now, we could always want more money, of course. You know, that's never going to be enough for this sort of work. But actually, at the same time, I think there is a lot of money that goes into local communities that's not necessarily organised in the best way. So we're wanting to develop a Thriving Communities Fund that will enable multiple investment from different agencies that can be used then effectively at that local level. You know, that's not going to be easy. It's going to be quite tricky to build, but we're really committed to building that over the next year. So I think, you know, we need to keep talking. We need to have the experts that have contributed to these reports around the table, and work through what those solutions can look like. But it's not that there's not a simple fix to this. This isn't, you know, the NHS should fund, or the Department for Culture, Media and Sport should fund. This is truly a new way of thinking about how we support civic society to thrive.
Right. I mean, the other thing that sort of occurs to me also is there's obviously a massive need around like COVID rehabilitation, and there's also a massive need around sort of COVID next wave preparedness, with a particular focus on communities that are hard hit. And I'm sure you could point at some communities in your patch who have carried a large burden around COVID. And I wonder whether there's something there around getting into some of the spend that the NHS will roll out around preparing for COVID and helping people to rehabilitate who've been sick with COVID. I think we need to maybe stop thinking the money needs to all come from primary care and all come from social prescribing. The NHS spends a lot of money, and some of that VCSE organisations would be quite well placed to help deliver. And, you know, I wonder whether there's something there. We're not going to resolve all of this. If any of you have questions, ideas for Michelle, please do contribute in the chat. I'm going to ask Gemma Bruce from Turning Point, who are one of our National Voices relatively large members who work in all areas of health, but focus really very much on people with drug and alcohol problems. Gemma, what's your question, if you can unmute yourself?
Hi. Just to say, the fantastic presentations, thank you so much to all the panel. That was really good. You really did whiz through a lot of stuff. But I'd like to ask the panel about your views on the extent to, and lots of you, several of you touched on this, but the extent to which social prescribing is currently supporting people with complex needs. So people experiencing homelessness or addiction or serious mental illness, so on. What you think the potential is for this area of work to grow, and what you think might be holding it back.
Yeah, really important question. It's no good if it only works for people whose needs are actually relatively straightforward. I mean, everybody's needs matter, but we need to really focus at the sharp end of inequality, obviously. I wonder, Kate, whether you've come across in your engagement with community groups examples of people really focusing on those people with more complex needs. Kate Jopling, she's still there?
Kate, could you unmute yourself?
So it's fine. I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you, Sam. This was a really big theme that kind of led to the comments we've made about inequality, because actually, you know, although social prescribing is seen as quite a universal service, in many areas, it's the cases that are coming through are quite complex, and I think that reflects what Michelle was saying as well. You know, many of the people who really could benefit from that holistic support have complex needs. We did hear that in some areas, the decision, generally in places where there was pre-existing social prescribing schemes that were serving a general population, that the PCM money was being channeled into specific areas of need. So I heard an example of working with vulnerable women, for example. But I think that there's definitely a need to make sure that two things happen. One, that we're thinking carefully and using, you know, data to inform how we target social prescribing support in communities, particularly where needs are complex. The other thing I think we need to do is make sure our expectations of link workers are really realistic. So caseloads will be lower if you're working with more complex cases. We've got to make sure the system and structure is flexible enough for that. And then I think we've got to make sure that we don't imply that social prescribing, a mainstream social prescribing service, is a panacea for everyone. And we recognise that actually specialism, including it looking really quite different to the sort of baseline model, is good, and a good way of ensuring that we're meeting people's needs. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter what the bridge looks like. We're trying to create a bridge between a clinical system and those non-medical needs that can be met in the community. And I think that's critical. But there are some examples in some places, but there's definitely space for more of this.
Sajid, I wonder whether in your work in Greater Manchester, and I know that you also work with faith communities in your particular role, they're also sometimes described as being remote from mainstream statutory services. Have you got, you know, learning to share about making all of this work for the people who have got the greatest need? You need to unmute yourself.
The thing is that there might be remote or hard to reach for the public sector, but they're not remote or hard to reach for the voluntary sector. And so it's basically, rather than trying to do things themselves, what they need to do is they need to reach out to the voluntary sector. The NHS or the CCG, whichever one you look at it, can easily find 100, 200 million pounds for emergency work. All we're asking for is a fraction of that for prevention work, because the work that the voluntary sector does may not bear results within the current financial year, but in terms of long-term savings, it's immense.
Yeah.
And then I think also the other thing also is that with regards to the hard to reach, so-called hard to reach groups, or the difficult ones, the ones furthest away from are those who are basically not engaging because they're unsure, they're afraid, or they don't know. However, if the work was done through the voluntary sector, we know where those people are, we know where those organizations are, and as a sector, we can reach out to them and get them on board.
Thank you. Right, on to the next question. Dr. Mohan Sekiram, can you unmute yourself?
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you very
Excellent.
clearly.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, James. Thanks, Craig, for your talks. They were great. And I think there's some great momentum going across social prescribing across the country, which is visibly, you can see it. I've got a question around the role reimbursements, the new ones which are coming through. And I want to see how they may link in, because certainly some stages are mature, and they want to see how they may link in with health coaches and some of the care coordinators to sort of bring a more coordinated approach to some of these non-medical needs. And I think it's great that the social prescribers have kind of opened the door to let the sort of the Avengers team to come through. So I kind of want to see how that might fit in. Have you got any thoughts on that? And that could go to anyone on the panel.
Right, I'll ask James and Craig maybe to respond to that. James, sort of from an NHS perspective, it would be really useful to explain how these different roles are sort of envisaged to work together. And then I'll ask Craig whether you've come across, because it strikes me that some of the work you're in straddles the sort of health coaching, social prescribing space. James, over to you first maybe. So how is it meant to work?
Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks for a great, if not slightly challenging question, Mo. And it's lovely to hear you this morning. I can't see you, unfortunately, but I do know what you look like. So it's good to get your question. And you know, just big up to you and shout out to the fantastic work that you're doing in Merton. Amazing programs of social prescribing, and a great way in which a primary care network and a GP practice is actually reaching out and working very closely with its local community. I think it's a really, really fine example. So specifics in the question. So in the Conservative Party manifesto, in the general election in December, it was set out that there'd be 26,000 new roles within general practice, and actually we're really pleased that a significant number of these are roles that are directly supporting personalised care. So over 7,000 roles, the 4,500 link workers I've mentioned, and as Mohan's mentioned, the health coaches and personalised care and support navigators as well. So I think these three roles are going to work very, very closely together within a multidisciplinary team within the practice. And I think the link worker is a core role here to take referrals from the GP or directly from individuals, and they would be identifying whether the person would benefit from a health coach as well, and there'll be a health coach in the practice that can work with that individual to improve skills, knowledge and confidence, alongside the opportunity for a social prescription and connection with the voluntary sector organisation, and then alongside support from a care navigator to navigate through the various biomedical interventions that the individual may have, whether that's physiotherapy sessions or whether that's any secondary care provision that's required for them. So, you know, we're putting three new roles into general practice. It's not massively tested at the moment. This is experimental, but we've committed the funding, we've committed the resources, and we've made the national commitment to the numbers of people. And I think it's one of the most exciting developments for primary care to have these non-medical roles that are championing a different way of people improving their health and well-being. So we're going to have to see how it rolls out over the next few months. But thanks for highlighting it, Moen, because I think it's a really important part to support the context of social prescribing.
Right, thank you. Craig, have you seen in practice examples of it working well or not working so well? This Avenger team, I quite like that, of new roles working together.
Moen, thanks for a brilliant question, mate. I wouldn't expect anything less. I think I have, but not just recently, but a long time ago. And one of the things I'll often say if I'm around about talking is that when I explain to my aged father what social prescribing is, which is about going out into the community and helping people and working with them underpinning needs, he would explain to me very, very succinctly that that's what we used to call common sense, which is great. And because it is, isn't it? And so we have seen those across the UK from our research. And I would encourage colleagues to look at how social prescribing is working across the UK. So Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, as well as England, where there are different approaches, and maybe take a pool of those approaches and how people move into the community. And if I can link this question to something that Michelle asked a bit earlier, is while COVID is a significant challenge to us, I do believe there is an opportunity there. And one of the great medical minds, Louis Pasteur, said, chance favours the prepared mind. And so perhaps saying, as Sajid very eloquently identified, that the voluntary sector, the people that the NHS find hard to meet, actually we work with them all the time. And that is part of it. So the work I did as chair of the volunteer cell across Bedfordshire and Luton, we helped because we already worked with a variety of groups, whether they be faith-based or gypsy and traveller groups or whomever. And so I think by highlighting the value that you can add from the VCSE to perhaps the integrated care systems in England and the other health systems in Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, people will see an opportunity that perhaps they don't see in their day-to-day work. And the final thing I'd just like to say is what our report showed is that referrals are coming from lots of other places. A lot of people do not go to their GPs. Mm-hmm. So, too strong a focus on GP as a referral route is a challenge because you miss a whole range of other people. So community pharmacy, police, fire, all these people are out there that could be part of this Avenger group, if you like, that already know the challenges locally. I think certainly in England, the integrated care systems could be more effective in gathering that data. And then if they knew that, they could support the voluntary sector. And I do think everybody would win from that process.
Thank you so much, Craig. Really interesting. I wonder whether that's the takeaway learning from today, is that we're all Avengers and that we're all fighting the good fight. Right, I've got one more question from Tim and Philagoff. I hope I say that name right. And he's asking, I think, about the connection between social prescribing and asset-based community development and how we can see more of both, really. Tim, are you around and can you answer?
Yeah, no, I'm here.
Excellent, can hear you.
And yeah, I was just going to, obviously the original job description with the original guide that came out from NHS England focused on the role of community development. The 950 people that come on stream since the end of last year came straight into something rather alarming in terms of the virus, and everything had changed. And it also had to do a lot of proactive outreach, which has been incredibly valuable, and I think everybody wants to keep. I was just really trying to understand whether the reports throw up anything about how much those link worker roles did impact on asset-based community development, how much, obviously, but accepting that it's been a very strange 6 months.
Right, maybe I'll start with Kate this time. Kate, did we learn anything about those approaches, or did you just informally in your conversations come across learning about, well, where does this fit in building wider community resilience and better community connection and people becoming activated and solving problems and supporting each other? What are your thoughts on this? You need to unmute yourself. Is that not working?
Sorry, you had to permit me. That's fine. That's all right. You need to keep me under control. This did come up, and I think what we saw was that in reality, where we were recruiting PCN link workers to do the whole job, it's really not very realistic to do that community building role alongside the individual link working, particularly when there are many cases. And I think Tim's right that through COVID, link workers have pivoted to even more of a role working very directly with individuals. So if we want to see that community development work happen, and it's critical, particularly in those communities that are more deprived, where the voluntary sector is weaker, where the infrastructure just isn't there, then we're going to need to kind of build that back in and be proactive in making sure it's there. So in established social prescribing schemes, which have been kind of well funded pre the NHS rollout, we do tend to see link workers alongside community builders in one way or other, and that works really well. But it's a real challenge within the current structures, and I think my optimistic side would say there's a real opportunity, because we're going to be seeing more link workers going into through PCNs, and this is an opportunity to kind of pull that back and say, actually that critical work developing the sector is really important and needs to be the focus.
Excellent. I'm going to ask James and Sajid to briefly respond to this point as well, because I think it's a really important one. Kate's already said there's some learning that comes out of COVID around the role of communities and where link workers have sat in that. James, is there something you want to say about where how all of this panned out during COVID? Because I think a lot of people started a job that then changed overnight, like 4 weeks into their job, and I think different places did different things with their social prescribing schemes and their link workers. Maybe you could just briefly, and then I asked Sajid the same question: how did you, is there something from Greater Manchester that you could contribute here? What happened during COVID, and where are communities now in connection with the link worker schemes?
What happened during COVID? That's an amazing question, Charlotte, and great to see and hear from you as well, Tim, with a really good question and thought process here. And I think there's a few things I would say. I mean, obviously, enough's been talked about COVID situation, unprecedented, and the rival challenge and all of that. We know the significant challenge it's been for the country, and obviously specifically where I'm sitting from the health service perspective. And what I think is interesting when you think about social prescribing is that we saw a massive explosion because of lockdown and the necessity of enforcing that, of people reaching out to things that kept them well. Now there was a huge rise in people downloading Couch to 5K app, for example, 400% increase, I believe, on the Public Health England app. There was people, engaging in community choirs online, and we had Gareth Malone's community choir. We had Joe Wicks doing his morning PE. Many of the activities that for years we've known are really important to people suddenly became front and centre within the way in which people supported themselves during lockdown. And I know that not everybody could access those activities, and I know that there was some gaps in that. But I think that in many ways it strengthened the case for social prescribing to be a thing. And a lot of the tricky conversations I've had to get this off the ground over the last few years have started to ease as a consequence of people recognising that individuals need activity in their life. They need an occupation, they need arts and culture and sport and recreation, and they need the natural environment to live their best life. So I think that has really, really helped. I think that, as Tim pointed out, we had this real difficulty with effectively a very new workforce, a cultural shift in the NHS with the introduction of link workers hitting the ground running at a point that the ground suddenly changed from underneath all of our feet. And consequently, I think some of the challenges that we faced have been specific to that context. And I'm hopeful now that we've got a bit more time to put the additional resources in place that link workers need to recruit more link workers through the rapid recruitment programme, and that some of that will now bed down. So we've had to change. You know, we switched to fortnightly webinars for link workers. We've had over 700 people attending some of those. It's been incredibly buoyant as a way of getting advice out. But you know, it's been a challenge across all areas. But I think there are some positives that have come from it.
Thank you, Sajid. How have you responded, and how have your colleagues responded?
Yeah, again, I think this is the value of local. We had about 800 local individuals volunteer to support those who were isolating, self-isolating, or were unable to get out. If you compare that to the national NHS responder scheme, which incidentally NAFCA did a freedom of information request, cost £10.8 million. So we said there isn't the money, but money can be found. So the National Good Sam process recruited 6 volunteers, recruited 1,700 volunteers in Bury, but only 6 were allocated roles. And those 6 that were allocated roles had already been dealt with by our volunteers. So we have informal volunteering and we have formal volunteering. Informal volunteering is neighbours helping neighbours. We saw a lot of that. But then formal volunteering, where we've recruited volunteers and we've specifically sent them out to jobs. And there were cases of individuals putting leaflets to people's doors and said, I can volunteer for you. In one case, a gentleman walked away with a brand new cooker from an old lady's house, said it was unsafe. In another case, they took money from somebody to go and do their shopping and never returned. So there were so many cases like that occurred. Whereas if you coordinate it at a local level with a local community group, the community group knows the neighborhood, they know the people there. When they respond, they go in, they're actually taking care of those individuals. So, we were discussing where will we find the resources from? Well, I think that this is a clear example of where £10.8 million of national resources have had no impact whatsoever on a local level in terms of the COVID response, whereas locally, the volunteers and the voluntary sector have had an immense impact and continue to do so.
Thank you. Stark reminder that all volunteers aren't equal. Really interesting. There is now a whole debate, as far as I can tell, kicking off on the chat around digital and how that is difficult to access for some people, and also the needs of older people and people who are still not really able to mix very much in community centres and so on. I don't think we will have time to unpack all of that, I'm afraid. There's so much more obviously still to be said. Right, I give you panellists now a very brief warning, and Sam a brief warning to unmute the panellists, please. I'll ask you all to say literally in 30 seconds what you've learned today and what you will take away from the conversation we've just had to progress the issues we've just talked about. And there were a lot of issues, so you can pick whatever, but I'd like you to very briefly say one thing you're taking away from today. And to give you a bit of time to think, I'll start by saying I am taking away that there is a huge appetite amongst the people who've signed up here today to talk to each other, as well as to listen to a learned panel, and that we as National Voices need to have a think about how we can maybe facilitate some of this and enable you all to work together, because I'm really sensing a real desire from all of you, hundreds of people, to learn from each other, which is wonderful to see. Right, that's my 30 seconds of what I'm taking away. I'm now asking Craig, do you want to give us what's your pearl of wisdom?
Yeah, thanks for putting me first. I would just say that, the passion of everybody on here is wonderful. And sometimes people get frustrated because they're passionate about it. And what I would say to everybody who is not in the voluntary sector is that the voluntary sector needs funding to function. And it has, I said it before, this multiplier effect. It reaches across the breadth. So it is a wonderful place to invest your money because it supports community.
Wonderful, thank you. Sajid, what's your pearl of wisdom?
I think we all are in the same boat that, and Craig said it eloquently, the voluntary sector cannot operate on thin air. We've done so much for so long with so little. We believe we can do anything, but the reality is we need resources to do it. And the one thing I think that we need to take away from here is that resources can be found at a national level when they need it. The NHS responders being an apt example there, most recent one. So let's look at it realistically and explore options of how we can put some resources at a local level that will have a huge impact.
Thank you. Kate, what's your takeaway?
Well, I won't repeat the funding point. I mean, I think one little reflection just on this sector. I think this is a sector that wants to make things work, and nothing that's come up today shows any different to that. We believe that connecting our capacity and resource to the health system is a way to keep people well. And I think the point about this is that those relationships, those collaborative relationships, which often do need resource to kind of fuel them, and they need particularly that support to get the infrastructure right so that we can connect to one another at the right level, that collaboration is really, really powerful, and we need to make sure we're enabling that. And this is a sector that is going through an absolutely horrific time, and we do need to make sure that we're properly supporting each other to have that equal relationship.
Thank you, Kate. Stag reminder that for many of National Voices members, community fundraising has gone completely off a cliff whilst meeting extended needs. So it's a really tricky time. James, you have the last words. What's your pearl of wisdom?
Well, reflecting what others have already mentioned, really, it's just the amount of passion and commitment to making this work is absolutely fantastic. We have moved on considerably, I think, from this being theory, from this being something that we were saying, would it work, wouldn't it work? We've proven the case, it works, it's great. We all have a strong consensus on the need for this to be part of society and to be an integral part of the health service. We've got some challenges, and we need to continue to pull together in the same direction to face those, and I'm looking forward to working with partners to work through the recommendations, and we can obviously talk about this beyond today's conference, and it's just been a great opportunity to share and reflect on this, and we're just up for the challenge of getting this right.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you so much to all the panelists today. You've been real good team players and stuck to time and made it work. Thank you for everybody signing up today and contributing so energetically on the chat. Thank you for everybody who responded to the survey and who attended our workshops and our webinars and gave us the benefit of their experience. Please stay engaged. Hit Twitter today. I think Craig has an ambition that we need to get this trending. So, let's fulfill Craig's ambition to get this trending on Twitter. But, much more importantly, let's get this working in the real world. And you are all part of the solution. And I really look forward to working with all of you on this. Thank you from the National Voices team, and stay in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.